You got somebody coming in with fancy clothes, and of course the rich are never alone. They always have some servants with them, helping them. And they're probably making a big show, maybe even a big parade coming in. And they come in there in their Lincolns and their Cadillacs and their Lexus, and I'm sure that's what they were driving at the time of Christ. And then they give their money in a way, he actually says in one place, they blow trumpets. Fanfare. Any musicians in here that know what a fanfare is? That's the introduction where you have that blaring trumpet. You know, the trumpets in the old movies, Robin Hood perhaps, where they announce something coming up. They would do that just because they were giving to the temple at that time. Now that's a little ludicrous. We say, well, that's stupid. God never intended that. Of course not. We know that. That's not the problem. The problem is they thought it was okay to do that. In fact, what they were really doing was thinking it was okay to bring attention to themselves while doing that. And bringing attention to yourself is something that we find Jesus condemns them for probably as much or more than anything else. Condemning them for their self-seeking behavior. I like it when somebody gives. No, let me put it more personal. I like it when I'm able to give. And it doesn't have to be much. Maybe somebody needs a couple of dollars for something, I'll give it to them. I don't care. You say, well, what if they go use it for booze? Well, that's between them and God, isn't it? I'm not giving it to them, I'm giving it to God in their hands. They then choose what to do with it. I'm giving it to God first. In fact, that's one of the things the Apostle Paul tells the brethren in southern Greece. He says, there were brethren up north that gave themselves first to God. And then after having done that, they gave themselves to you. And the contributions they gave to them was to help in the spreading of the gospel at that time. But first they did what? They gave themselves to God. So here are these rich folks coming in. They were born into God's family, right? They're of the lineage of Abraham, the blood of Abraham. And they go into this big self-serving show of look at how much I'm giving to God. You got to be careful of that kind of game, don't you? Because when you give as much as you possibly can, and it's a lot, there's always somebody else who is able to give a little bit more, or a little bit more. And if you're measuring your righteousness by how much you gave, there's always going to be somebody giving a little more. And that's true whether we're looking at a dollar amount or a percentage amount. Can anybody argue that the percentage that was given by the rich matched the percentage that was given by the widow? Not at all, can we? In fact, Jesus says she gave all that she had to live on. And it amounted to a whole whopping 2 pennies. Well, it said copper coins. I think King James uses the word mites, which we don't even have a clue as to what that means otherwise. But it was just a couple of small copper pennies. But it was all she had. Any of you remember back when you were 4, 5, 6 years old and you'd go to the store with a penny to get a piece of candy? By the way, it takes $1 now to buy a piece of candy. Well, never mind. It's a different issue. But that penny, did you ever lose it on the way to the store sometime? Oh, man, that was devastating, wasn't it? Why? Because that's all I had. We have understanding of this. We just don't always keep that understanding in perspective. Now, take this widow, for example. I could tell you the theology of taking care of yourself. I could go, for example, to the Apostle Paul later, who says that if an individual doesn't take care of his own, he's worse than an infidel. If he doesn't feed his own family, if he doesn't shelter his own family, he doesn't clothe his own family, if he doesn't take care of his own, he is no better than an infidel, an unbeliever, an ungodly person. And says she had an obligation first to take care of herself and her family, didn't she? Nod your head, yes. She did, didn't she? Is that what Jesus commends her for, though? Of taking out the pennies and saying, okay, I got to hold on to these, and all right, I need these this week, but I've got one I can give extra. That's not what he commends her for, does it? He says he gave everything she had to live on. That hurts. I like it. I mean, it's a great story. But it's more than just a story about the widow giving everything she had. It's a story also of the rich giving a lot more. Is that proper English? A lot more? No English teachers in here? Okay, good. Giving a whole lot more than she did. And yet, she gave more, ultimately. By the way, how much money does God need from us? Pardon me? He needs none of it, does he? Then why does he tell us to give? It's for us, not for him, isn't it? When they built the tabernacle, Moses called for the people to bring in their gold and their jewels and their silver. He finally had to put up a hand and say, stop. We're overwhelmed. We got too much. Why? Because they were giving it to God. It had nothing to do with how much they had or how much excess they had. It had to do with them giving it to God. The temple, I put a picture of an artist's depiction of the holy place in the temple on the front of the bulletin. I don't know if that's what it looked like or not, but that's good enough, isn't it? It's rich, it's beautiful. By the way, the ceiling was extremely high. And of course, that was to give that awe-inspiring majesty of God look to it. But it was all gilded in gold. It was all furnished with this extremely expensive materials. When it came time for Babylon to destroy Jerusalem and to take the temple's treasures, they took the treasures of the temple back to Babylon and literally put it in the temples of some of their pagan gods. And when it came time, some 70 years later, for them to return to Jerusalem and under the mandate of the king to go back and rebuild the temple, he pulled all of those serving utensils, all of that furniture, out of the pagan temple and told them to take it with them to furnish the house of God. You say, well, he didn't actually sacrifice anything because it wasn't his in the first place. Well, guess what? It's not ours in the first place either, is it? We work as if it is. We teach each other in America that it is. We tell each other stories about hard work, sacrifice, and dedication, and we'll become rich in America. But that's not really what it's all about, is it? Do we have to take a vow of poverty in order to be a Christian? Let me ask you right quick. Anybody in here thinks that? No? No, we don't have to take a vow of poverty. But we do have to have an attitude of which whatever we own belongs to God first, don't we? What if he needs it? Well, I don't know how he's going to tell us, but what if he needs it? Is it available? I don't mean just for lease or rent or just a little temporary time. I mean, is it available? If he says he needs it, is it available? You're willing to give it up for it? I'm willing to give up my firstborn son. Oh, that's no sacrifice, though, is it? Sorry. Sacrifice. We talk about sacrifice. We're not really sure we understand it anymore. We don't kill blooded animals anymore for this. We don't take bulls and goats and bring them in to put them on an altar, either here or anywhere else in the world. We don't do that anymore. But David was going up to the Mount Moriah and was going to actually make an offering for his sin. And the owner of the property said, no problem, I'll give you the bull, I'll give you the land, whatever you need. I'll help you build the altar. What was David's response? He says, no, that's not my sacrifice then. Does that make sense to you? It makes sense to me. And the more we get into the scriptures, the more we understand that type of thinking. The mentality, it wasn't just the fact that God was receiving a burnt offering, it was the fact of who sacrificed to provide that burnt offering. And it's that sacrifice that is a part of it. But in giving, this woman gave all that she had to live on. How many of you live on more than 2 pennies a week? 2 pennies a day? Frances lives on more than that. She's willing to acknowledge that. Yeah, we all do, don't we? Now, I don't know whether that 2 pennies was the same as 2 pennies to us today or not. I don't know whether that represented $2,000, $20, $2, 2 pennies. I get the impression it represented 2 pennies. She was not a wealthy woman. That's one of the reasons the story struck Jesus and allowed him to use it the way it was. It was the contrast between the wealthy making a big to-do about how much they're giving, but they were giving out of their abundance. She was giving all she had. We need to think in terms of our lives and God's life in such a way where giving is not thought of in terms of how much money am I going to give this week? Not in terms of what's my check going to be this week or what's my bills going to be this week. Not think of it in terms of I'm giving this, but rather what's the need that I'm seeing. We had a contribution that was given special. Eastern European missions. We've been doing that for several years now. In the big picture of things, I doubt that the numbers that we send in are all that big compared to the total amount they receive from around the country and around the world. It takes millions for them to operate that project. They've literally bought a publishing company that used to print the communist atheist literature for the Soviet Union, and they're now printing Bibles in Ukrainian, Russian, Latvian, and I don't know how many other languages, 15 or so. And they're using that to be able to spread the Word of God. And we buy into it with saying, hey, I'm going to give something. I was told by a brother in this church, by the way, I'm not going to tell you who it was, but at least your sisters know it wasn't you, right? That our contributions were going to go down whenever we had a special contribution like that, our regular contribution, the giving for the regular work of the church. I said, no, it's not. This is special. We're going to see it as special. We're going to give as if it's special. Now, I'm not bragging on you or anything, but I don't think our contributions went down. We didn't take money out of this pot to put it into that pot. We saw a need and gave as we felt we could. Now, this year it happened to be a little bit less than it was last year. Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. Because it's what we could give this time, right? When we had an individual come through that had a great need, just a small group on Wednesday night pulled out of their pocket what cash they had on hand to provide help for an individual that was traveling across country that we wanted to try and help. And instead of giving him $20, instead of helping him with maybe a little bit of food and maybe a drink and maybe a little money in his pocket so he could buy lunch on the way, in other words, barely helping him at all, he received enough to actually be able to make the trip, pay for the bus fare, pay for his lodging if he needed it, and his food, and it was just because somebody took some money out of their pocket. Now, if I'd taken money out of my pocket and put it on there, which I did put some on there, but if I'd taken it out and that's all there was, that wouldn't have gone very far. But it would have meant something to God because I was giving it to God. I wasn't giving it to this individual. The widow gave to God. Do you think she was thankful for what she had? I think so. I don't know that the Scripture actually tells us enough to go into detail on this woman. We don't know how old she was. She was a widow, we know. We don't know if there was any other family that was there to take care of her. But you know, a widow indeed is defined for us elsewhere as someone who does not have family that can take care of them. We don't have any of that information. We don't have her name. We don't have the color of her hair, although if she was an old widow, guess what? Chances are it was what color, ladies? Yeah. Gray happens to all of us, doesn't it? But we don't know that because it wasn't necessary to tell us that. All that was necessary to tell us was the contrast between those who thought they were doing a great thing by giving to God all this money out of their abundance, and this poor little widow who wouldn't even look up, just simply dropped her little coins in the basket and went on her way. Jesus, though, brags on her, not on them, doesn't he? Jesus brags on that poor widow. Jesus in his sermons would often talk about the bragging of the self-righteous ones, the individuals who thought it was good to expand their appearance of spirituality, to make it seem like they were really more spiritual than everybody else. They would, for example, wear larger prayer shawls so that the fringes and tassels were more evident as they walked on the street. Boy, there goes, that must be a righteous man. How do I know? Why, look at his prayer shawl. Look at his tassels. Look at the trappings of his spirituality. Jesus actually says it's empty. They were looking for the praise of men, and they got it. So they got their reward. You understand what that means? It means they got their reward. They wanted the praise of men, they got it. What about the praise of God? They didn't get that, did they? Blessed is the man who is praised by God for what he does, not for the praise of men that he receives. Blessed is the man if he drives the rattiest, ugliest, most worn-out vehicle with the holiest of shoes and worn-out clothes. If God praises him, then he's blessed. You don't have to wear holy clothes and worn-out clothes and ugly shoes to be blessed by God, though, do you? I'm reminded of a couple of rich people that were in the following of Jesus. Zacchaeus was actually apparently pretty rich, and he followed Jesus. Nicodemus, one of the members of the Sanhedrin, apparently wealthy. I'm of the opinion, personally, that James and John weren't all that poor. They had a business that they worked with their father up at the Sea of Galilee. They were businessmen making money, selling fish. You say, well, that's a horrible business. No, it's not. Apparently, it was one that gave them quite a bit of leeway. Do you realize that they had access to the courtyards of the high priests? Why? Probably because they'd been there before. Probably because they had sold fish to these houses before, to the palaces of the leaders of that time. But when Jesus calls them, he says, come with me and I'll make you fishers of men. It says they dropped what they were doing and walked away. I don't know that God's ever going to ask you to do that. I don't know that God's ever going to ask you to drop what you're doing and walk away. I mean literally just walk away. Not get your affairs in order, sell the house, get rid of the car, whatever it is that you've stored in the garage for too long and don't even remember what's there anymore. Got to find a way to get rid of it. No, I'm not talking about you just get up and walk away. I don't know that he'll ever do that. I knew a guy once that happened to. He had promised, he and his wife had decided they were going to go to Germany to become missionaries. Had a 5-year plan. You guys ever hear anybody about making a 5-year plan for something and having the plans change? Year 2, Baytown, Texas. Floods came through, wiped out their house. They thought, okay, we'll rebuild. After all, we're 3 years away from being able to go anyway, right? Nod your head, yes, that's right. I mean, what do you need to do to move across the ocean? Not have anything to carry? Wouldn't that be a good starting point? Year 3, floods came through and washed them out again. Now, they're dense in South Texas as a people, as a general statement, I think. But Billy and Trent Campbell decided, maybe we're putting it off and we shouldn't be. Maybe this is the time. I said, okay, go. Now, I will tell you this. I believe he's probably the only missionary in Germany that still, after 40-some-odd years, speaks German with a South Texas accent. But they went. They thought that they had to wait until everything was right. They had to wait until they'd made the preparations. They had to wait until they had the monies. They had to wait until they had whatever it was they felt they would need over there. And God said, go. Leave what you got here and just go. In their case, God wiped it out, so they didn't have anything to go. So he didn't really give them the option of just leaving it and walking away. But this widow gave up everything she had. But, we put stress on ourselves by buying a car we can't afford. Or now we've got health insurance we're going to have to buy. Never mind, that's a different issue. We put ourselves under that kind of stress. We're okay with that kind of stress. We don't like it. We complain about it. But we did that to ourselves. Someone says, well, the widow's doing that to herself here, isn't she? But she's giving it to God. Brother Mark says, how many of us really trust God that much? That it'll be okay. Even if we give up everything we have, it'll be okay. Now, a lot of preachers, when they preach that in our modern times, say, well, see, God's going to provide everything you want, everything you need. No, He's not. He never promised that you'll have that fancy car, fancy clothes, fancy food, fancy house. He never promised that. What does He promise you? Actually, He promised you suffering, doesn't He? He promises suffering. Not that we should artificially make ourselves suffer, but He promises that if we're going to suffer in the name of Christ, that we should be glorified, and we should glorify God in that. But we, on the other hand, we approach it backwards. We approach it from ourselves and then saying, I don't want to suffer. I don't want to put myself in an uncomfortable position. I don't want to put myself in a position of having to do it God's way. I instead will just give Him a little bit so He knows I care, but not enough to hurt me. Is that the way the widow gave us an example? It's not the way she gave an example at all, is it? That was the way that the rich Jews gave an example. Of out of their abundance, they gave all this money. Friends, do you think really God cares whether you give money or not? Now, think about it. I mean, from the standpoint of the actual cash. Does God need your cash? What's going to happen to this cash when the world burns up? I'm listening. What's going to happen to the gold when the world burns up? What's going to happen to the platinum and the silver and all the other, the diamonds and the jewels when the world burns up? What's going to happen with the monuments we build to ourselves? Even the so-called everlasting pyramids are what? They're ruins, aren't they? They don't look anything at all hardly like what they looked originally. Saw a commercial the other day, said they were a mistake anyway. They were supposed to be a cube. Sorry. I did see some TV after all. What does God want us to do? Don't gain the whole world and lose your own soul. Instead, the soul is the precious thing, isn't it? All the rest of this is irrelevant. Whether we're talking about money, whether we're talking about things, whether we're talking about planning for the future. By the way, how many of you trust in God totally to take care of you next week, next month, next year, no matter what? Got a couple of you in here. All right, do you have a savings account? Why do you have a savings account? I'm not saying you shouldn't have a savings account. I'm just asking you. You say you trust God, but then you've got a savings account. When you look at the rich people that were given at that time, they trusted God too, didn't they? I mean, if you asked them, they would have said so. Absolutely, we trust God. But they had savings accounts. They had rooms that were filled with the gold. They just went in there and took one bag out of the many bags that were there to be able to have something to show as they went down to the temple. The widow, on the other hand, didn't have a savings room. She went in and took what she had, and apparently everything she had, and brought it to God. I'm not saying you have to get rid of your savings account and give it to the church. In fact, the last thing in the world He wants to do is to put something on me that would burden me in my spirituality, and making me wealthy would do that. I'm just acknowledging my own limitations there. So God's not going to give me a lot of wealth. But in the life that we lead, we have wealth beyond measure anyway, because we have Christ in our lives, don't we? How many of you in here can actually take any dollar amount on a check or on some gold or some silver or property or whatever and actually say, this approximates what God has given me? It's just not there, is it? So when we talk about giving, it's not really, should I give more? It's really, have I given myself to God first? And then as the need arises, I give as I feel I can. First, asking the question, have I given myself to God first? I made the title of this, Becoming Like God. And I want to take just a second to tell you why. When God told the children of Israel that He was going to give them the land, they were going to possess it, He was going to take care of them, it was going to be a land that was bountiful. There This is just out of Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and there's 2 pages, and they all say the same thing. There's a phrase that keeps coming up. Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that the days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. That phrase, God is giving you. Deuteronomy 4:21. Lord was angry with me because of you, and he swore that I should not cross the Jordan, that I should not enter the good land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. God is giving you. Deuteronomy 5, verse 16. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long, that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Well, I didn't count them, so I don't know how much it is, but you can look it up yourself. Did God give a lot or a little? You say, well, he owned it all anyway, so he didn't give much, right? Okay, well, let me ask you this. Did they deserve it? Children of Abraham, were they righteous people? Is that why God gave it to them? No, they weren't righteous people. Were they faithful people? No, they weren't faithful people. But they were better than everybody else, right? No, actually, Scripture argues that they weren't. They weren't any better than anybody else. They were just like everybody else. But he had chosen them nevertheless, and he gave generously to them. So every once in a while we'll hear a preacher say, and I think it's legitimate, try to outgive God and see what happens. We can't outgive God, can we? Now see, we don't have the land of promise. We have something better. We have the Messiah. We have the Christ, the Son of God, whom God said, I will give to you. We have an offer of eternal life, which God has said, I give to you. God has given to us and is continuing to give to us, isn't he? And I'm not talking about our paychecks or our houses or our cars or our homes or our families even, for that matter. I'm talking about that he is continually giving us something much, much more than what we have here physically on this earth. But in your life, just start by giving yourself to God. And if you can outgive God, you'll become more and more like him all the time. Because what is the definition of God? Honestly, we have to come, at least in the context of this discussion, and say, God gives. And he gives until it hurts. You talking about sacrifice? We talked about it a little bit earlier. What was the greatest love that anybody has ever shown? Given his own life to die for us? But God gave his own Son to die for us while we were enemies, not friends. God gives, and he asks us to give as well. Please, if you need to come for the invitation, please come now while we stand and sing.